This is precisely the motivation of Marcela's talk. Please, Marcela.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and I would like to thank you, the organizers, for giving me opportunity to present our work in this space. As Claudia said, I will talk about clustering EEG data by law. Well, this is a joint work with Antonio Galvez and Fernando Nashman and Claudia Vargas. Fernando was doing his PhD and is part of the Neuromat project. We are going to continue working with the same experimental protocol presented in the previous work, where we have the sequence of hand claps that presented a strong or a weak beat or a silent unit that are generated by a stochastic chain. That this was analyzed by Alini and also in Hernandez et al. Well, so they know that the brain can effectively identify the context tree characterizing the source. This means that studying the EEG signal, they can retrieve the source that produced that signal that we know that follows this structure. No, and this is what was just presented. As you can see, this context tree has 8 final leaves, which each of them represent a context. No. So now what we want to do is to identify classes of model that uses we want to know if we can identify classes of model that used by the brain to encode statistical regularities of the environment. In fact, the question that we want to ask is if we can retrieve the statistical regularities of the stimulus sequence from the data recorded by the brain. So we are going to focus in the quaternary context tree model, where we have a strong beat followed by a weak beat, followed by a silent unit, and followed by another weak beat. And the strong beat and the silent unit are permanent positions. They always appear, while the weak beats are can be replaced with probability 1 minus epsilon by a silent unit. No, so from time to time you will see a silent unit, and otherwise you will see a weak beat. So the question that we're asking is what information is encoded in the EEG data sets, and if different information is encoded in the EEG data sets can result in the same context tree being retrieved. So we are going to discuss 2 conjectures about which information of the stimuli sequence may be encoded by this data, by the EEG data. The first conjecture was the one previously discussed, no, where the law of the EEG segments, which are functions in L2, is a function of the context that generated in a certain way. In this case, if we have 2 contexts that belong to the same context tree, the law of the EEG segments associated to each of these contexts will be the same if and only if these contexts are the same. So what we are saying is that the final leaf of the context tree present different laws. So for the quaternary case, that is what the tree that I showed you before, we have 8 different laws, which are the 8 different clusters. Each cluster contains all the EEG segments recorded after the occurrence of the same context. So we are not classifying, we are classifying the context, but we are classifying them according to what we see in the EEG segments. So this is the first conjecture. The second conjecture is that the encoder takes into account basic recurrent regularities. What does that mean? That there are papers in the neurobiology literature that support the idea that the brain synchronizes with the auditory stimuli and that uses that synchronization to make predictions. Then it is conceivable that the brain uses the recurrent strong beat to encode information in the stimulus sequence. This means that we know that in our sequence we will find in the first step a strong beat. 2 steps later, we will find a silent unit that we will call it consequence silent unit. And In the other remaining positions, we will find either a weak bit with probability 1 minus epsilon or a silent unit with probability epsilon. No, so you see this sequence. So this conjecture induces a partition, which is determined by the position of the strong bit. So for instance, in this case, we'll have all the contexts that in the final position have a strong bit. And in this case, we have all the contexts that in the middle position have a strong bit. In these cases, we have all the contexts that in the final position have a recurrent silent unit. And in this case, we have the context that in the final position have either a silent unit or a weak bit that are following a constituent silent unit. So the law of the segment, of the EEG segments in this case, the law of these functions are given by this partition. So all the contexts that belong to each of these 4 clusters will have the same law. So in this case, we would have 4 different clusters. So we expect to retrieve the same context tree model from the EEG data generated under both conjectures, but not the same classification structure. So in the first case, the classification structure was given by the final leaves. But in this case, the classification is given by this key color that we used. No, so all the contexts that have the same color determine a cluster. So we have these 4 different clusters. Conjecture 2 is not compatible with conjecture 1. For instance, if we consider the context 0, 0, 0 and the context 1, 0, 0 for conjecture 1, they would have different laws. While for conjecture 2, these 2 contexts have the same law. So we, in this point, when we want to challenge, we want to know if conjecture 2 may happen or not, we face a major problem because we should compare all the different contexts that we have. So the question is that if we can do a procedure where we can do all the possible comparisons, that are a lot of them, no? And well, the answer is that we can do it. And now the idea is to present how we are facing this problem. So we are going to present a clustering procedure based on the projective goodness of fit test introduced by Cuesta Alberto et al. And previously described in the other talks. No, the idea is that based upon this criteria, we are going to build a dissimilarity matrix that then will be used to clusterize the context, considering hierarchical clustering procedure. So how are we going to build this dissimilarity matrix? Well, so we have all the strings of 3 symbols occurring in the stimuli sequence that we have here. For each of these sequences, we can consider the corresponding EEG segments. So we will have for each of these one set of functions that will be these EEG segments. And what we want to do is to compare the law of each of these EEG segments among them. And we will do this by pairs. So we generate a random direction. In our case, it will be a Brownian bridge, and we will project these sets onto this direction. And we'll do this for we'll do this for each string of 3 symbols. The corresponding EEGs is what we're projecting the functions. So we will have for each of them a one-dimensional direction. Now, once we have a one-dimensional direction, we can compare the distribution by means of the classical Kolmogorov-Smirnov test that can compare, that is a test, it's a goodness of test aimed to determine whether 2 one-dimensional sets come from the same distribution or not, were generated by the same distribution or not. So when we have done this for all the pairs of free symbols, we will have for each pair either, well, so here is the idea put in a picture. No, we have the two sets, we project them considering the same Brownian bridge that was generated randomly. We then have the projections of these data sets, and finally we compare them, the cumulative function distribution functions by means of the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. So when we've done this, for each pair of strings, what we have is that either we accept that both laws, the laws of those projections are the same, or we reject that hypothesis. So we can put this into a matrix that will be a dissimilarity matrix that will have a 0 if they have the same law, and a 1 if not. Due to numerical instabilities, we can repeat this procedure many times, m times, a lot of times. Hence, for each random projection that we generate, each of these m random projection, we would obtain a different dissimilarity matrix that we can summarize into a final dissimilarity matrix that will be the mean of this dissimilarity matrix built. So with this dissimilarity matrix, we can use any hierarchical clustering procedure to construct the clusters. This procedure is what we call the clustering by law. So what we would like to measure is the distance between the theoretical probabilities of two EEG segments, which are functions of L2. From the statistical perspective, this is unfeasible, since we do not have a theoretical measure. So we want to approximate it. And the way in which we are approximate them is by means of the projection procedure. So we are not considering the distance between individual functions, which is what usually is done when one considers functional data. But what we are comparing is the empirical distribution of sets of functions. So this is the key difference between what we are doing and what is usually done when we have functional data. So let's go into the numerical study. Well, first of all, what we are going to do is to generate data according to each of our conjectures and see whether our procedure is able to retrieve these models or not in a theoretical way. So the first model, we have these 8 clusters, and in the second model, under the second conjecture, we have these 4 clusters. So we'll generate data under this conjecture, and we'll generate data under this conjecture, and for each conjecture we are going to apply our clustering procedure and see if we can retrieve this structure. So we generate the stimuli sequences following the probabilistic tree model. Then we simulate the stochastic sequences as discrete sine waves from different frequencies plus some noise. And we will then have data simulated following conjecture 1 presenting 8 clusters, and data simulated following conjecture 2, which will present 4 different clusters. We'll do these several times for several different sample sizes, and we will see if we can retrieve in each case the theoretical partition. So now, first of all, I want to show you just one replicate of each case situation. In this case, it's a replicate of the data generated with the first conjecture that presents 8 laws. So this is the context tree that generated the data. And in this case, what we have is, once we have applied the clustering by law procedure, we obtain a dendrogram since we are applying a hierarchical procedure. So here is the dendrogram that we obtain. Here are the contexts, and in this part, in this axis, what we have is the distance where the clusters were conformed. So what we can see is that the clusters were retrieved for a very high distance, no, and we can see that here we have clearly an 8 cluster structure, no. So we have the singletons that are the black the black leaves, and here we have these singletons. Each of them has a different law. Then here, for instance, we have the cluster that ends in a strong beat, and in this case we have the leaf that represents that cluster. Then we have the clusters that end in a weak beat followed by a strong beat, and it's represented here, and so on with the clusters in purples and the clusters in cyan. So what we can see is that at least in this replicate, things work well. Now we're going to move to the other conjecture, the data generated under the second conjecture. And in this case, we have a 4 cluster structure. Again, we can see here we have the context tree with the key color indicating which are the theoretical clusters. And again, what we can see is that we obtain 4 clusters. These 4 clusters I separated at the very beginning of the dendrogram. So this means that the groups are really well separated, and that the clusters retrieve the structure that we suspected, that has to be with the position of the strong of the recurrent positions. So we've done this several times. I think that there were 1,000 times for different sample sizes for each conjecture. And here what we have is the proportion of times where the theoretical partition is retrieved in each case. So what we can see is that, well, as the sample size grows, the number of times that we retrieve the theoretical partitions grows really fast. In fact, when we have more than 700 partitions, what we see is that in more of 90% of the times, for both conjectures, we retrieve the theoretical partition. So, well, it's not a proof, but we show empirically that our procedure works well. So now we are going to go to a really small example with real data. We are going to consider the same data set that has been considered by Noslin before, and we are going to restrict our study to the left prefrontal region of the scalp, considering the electrodes 11, 18, and 22. And we are going to average the signal of these electrodes. So before applying our clustering procedures, clustering data is really sensitive to outliers. We are going to remove the 10% of outlying observations, and the pruning procedure will be considering the functional depth of the data and pruning the 10% of the data that has lower depth. So here are the electrodes that we are considering, and we are going to retrieve a partition from the EEG sample per each participant. As not listened before, this data presents a very large intra-individual variability. So it's not a good strategy to put all the samples together from different participants. It's more wise to cluster each participant separately and then have a consensus strategy to organize all that information. So what we have done is to think in a consensus clustering procedure, because this would diminish the variability of the results and improve the clustering quality of the results. This is well known when you have this kind of problems in cluster, that you have to do this. So what is so we are going to build a consensus clustering. What is a consensus clustering? Well, we'll have a cluster, we'll have for each participant And then what we should do is to combine all those results. Then for each participant, we will build a matrix indexed by the strings, assigning a value 1, where those two contexts belong to the same cluster, and value zero otherwise. And then we are going to put all that information together. We are going to summarize it, as we have done before, averaging those matrices, and conform and use it into an hierarchical clustering strategy, so that to build a partition, a final partition. So in this case, this is the partition that we've got. First important thing is that, as expected by the second conjecture, we have 4 different clusters. So now we have to analyze these clusters. Well, the first cluster has these strings, the second cluster has these strings, the third one this, and the fourth this. So this cluster do not coincide strictly what we were expecting under the second conjecture. Because, for instance, here we have a string that has the strong position in the middle in the same cluster as these strings that do not have the strong position. And the strong position in the middle space is presented always in the third cluster. So which are the differences that we've got between our results and the theoretical results that we were expecting to retrieve if we could support conjecture 2? Well, the differences are not much. In one hand, we have this context that should be classified here, as I said before, and on the other hand, we have that the second cluster, it has a mixture of 2 behaviors. On one hand, we have these 2 contexts that have the strong position in the third position, so we expected them to be together. And on the other hand, we have these 2 contexts that have the constituent silent unit in the middle position, so they should go to the first cluster. And the other clustering, the other clusters are similar, are classified in the same way as we were expecting. So clearly, the question now is if this clustering structure is close enough to what we were expecting. So for that aim, what we propose is to compute numerically the probability of finding a partition as close or closer to the one that we to the one proposed by conjecture 2. Under the new hypothesis that all the partitions were equally likely to happen. This is an unusual way to think non-parametric tests, no? So what we have done is we simulated this, we computed main partitions, and we compared the theoretical partition, that is the one proposed by conjecture 2, with the ones that we simulated. And to compare those partitions, we used the adjusted rand index, which is a measure of the similarity between partitions, to determine the closeness of those partitions. And the estimated probability of having this result by chance was less than 1%. So we can conclude that this result is not obtained by chance. It's just that we have a similar pattern of what we present in conjecture 2. So, well, this is the final result I wanted to tell you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcela. Thank you, Marcela. So we have no time, but I mean, if there is a short question for Marcela or for Aline or for Noslin, please do it immediately or wait next year. No, okay. I don't think we'll have questions a little later. So I enjoyed very much hearing you. I'm sorry about the COVID and internet issues, But in any case, the movies will be available, and there will be a version of then the one we present with Aline and Nosling in Neuromat website. So, okay. So thank you very much to the 4 participants, and thank you for the audience. Many friends I'm here, I'm seeing here. I really enjoyed having all of you with us. And well, and continue tomorrow